Hello, and welcome to a special episode of They Live by Film. It's Adam here, solo this time, bringing you a bit of a special episode, seeing as we don't have a interview this week or a normal discussion episode that will be coming to you guys in the following week. So, with it being October, with it being spooky season, I thought it's going to be maybe a really cool idea for me to bring you guys a list of recommendations for films you might want to put into your rota coming up to Halloween. So I've essentially trawled through the last 100 years of horror filmmaking to put together a list of films that I think are great, that I've personally watched and can personally recommend to you. How I'm going to divvy this up is I'm going to go through every decade from the 1920s all the way up to where we are now in 2022, and I'm going to recommend you 3 films from every decade. It's going to cover a whole range of horror subgenres. There's a couple of films in here that are maybe only horror adjacent, but I still feel qualified, as a horror film because of the atmosphere or the feel of the film. So we're going to kick off right now with the 1920s. So in 1920, first off the list, we are talking about The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a German expressionist film from a director called Robert Vine, or Robert Veen. I'm not too sure on my German pronunciation there. As you may know, as film lovers, the German expressionist movement in the 1920s was incredibly influential. Not just for horror, but just for film in general, in terms of how films were made, how sets were used, how makeup was used. And Dr. Caligari, this film really sums up the best about the German Expressionist movement. Its set design, costume design, makeup is so incredibly inventive. It's so dreamlike. It's one of those films where you watch it and you're like, yeah, I can understand why this was so influential. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, it's with it being an older horror film from the 1920s, it's not going to have, the scares and stuff that you get used to in later decades. It is very much about the atmosphere, about the sense of maybe dread that goes throughout the film. It has a very dreamlike quality as well, which I think really lends to this horror film and horror in general. I think when it has a dreamy atmosphere or a nightmarish atmosphere even, can really sort of add to that sense of dread. So the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, certainly a film that I recommend, not just coming up to spooky season, but just generally speaking, because of how important of a milestone it is in film. And like that, this next film that I'm going to bring up, just as, if perhaps even more influential, we have the F.W. Murnau film, Nosferatu, which obviously I think everybody knows, the image of Max Schreck, even if you've never seen Nosferatu, even if you're not even too sure 100% what Nosferatu even is, that, Max Schreck as Count Orlok, because if you don't know the backstory behind Nosferatu, it was an unofficial adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. They stole the whole plot, but they at least had the heart to change some of the character names. But Nosferatu, obviously, it's pretty sure it's the first vampire film. It's absolutely the most influential vampire film until the sort of later ones came in that kind of really expanded upon the mythology, like the Universal Dracula or even Bram Stoker's Dracula from Coppola in the 90s. Again, like Dr. Caligari, it's not going to have much of a scare factor. I think it's extraordinarily creepy. I think it's a very creepy film. Even now, exactly 100 years later, I find it still an incredibly creepy film. It's so well made and well put together by Murnau, who's probably one of, if not the sort of most dynamic filmmakers of the silent era. So if you're a horror fan, and you haven't seen Nosferatu, maybe if you're put off by the fact that it's a silent film, don't let that put you off. It's an incredibly atmospheric film. It's really engrossing. It's very creepy. It's very well made, and Max Schreck as Count Orlok is iconic. He's a horror icon, and he deserves you to look at this film. And closing out the 1920s is a film that came out in 1928 by a German director working in Hollywood called Paul Lenny. This film is probably the most obscure one that I'm going to talk about maybe for a while. Um, I have a copy of it that was released by Eureka as part of their Masters of Cinema range, and I watched it and I thought it was fantastic. Again, it's a silent film. There was a sound version. This was made in the when people were testing out sound film as a possibility, but I believe the sound version is completely lost. So I have watched the silent version, which I think, again, without seeing the sound version, I can't say for sure, but the way they do the silent aspect of this film is fantastic because the title cards are incredibly creative. I've just realized I never told you the name of the film. It's called The Last Warning. Just to give you a very breakdown, it's very much a story that you've seen a lot in a lot of different pictures. Basically, it's about reopening a theater after a horrible tragedy happened previously with an old production. I think that's a story that we've seen a lot, and it's because of films like The Last Warning, which may not have the long-reaching appeal as something like Nosferatu, but for what it did for horror at that time, we can't really undersell how important it is. And again, it's a very creepy film. It's very atmospheric. It does, like a lot of horror kind of later down the line, it does actually have funny moments. I think there's a very thin line between comedy and horror. They're both about setups and payoffs. There's a very thin line. There's a reason why so many comedy directors have gone into horror, like Jordan Peele, or the guy who did the new Halloween movies, whose name has escaped me at the moment. And I think The Last Warning plays off that very, very well. There is moments of creaky funniness, but also a lot of creepiness as well, and a lot of atmosphere. So The Last Warning is the last film I'm going to recommend from the 1920s. And now let's look at the 1930s. So the first film we're going to look at in the 1930s is another incredibly influential film, an incredibly famous film, an incredibly important film. And it's from 1931 by Universal, by an amazing director called James Whale. We have Frankenstein, the original sort of Frankenstein, Boris Karloff. In fact, all three films from this decade that I'm going to recommend to you all feature Karloff himself. But Frankenstein and James Whale movies in general, and I'm going to talk about another James Whale film in a few moments. He's such an artistic, creative director. He really gets Gothicism, and he gets horror, but he gets humor as well. There's just no other voice like him in this era. He's an auteur before auteurism was a thing. Frankenstein, again, it's a film that it's just caked in atmosphere. Everyone kind of knows the iconic moments from it, but I think you need to watch the whole film in order to really do the story and the film and the direction justice. It's a fantastic film, and it's a film that only James Whale himself could have beaten, because he did that. And this is the second film I'm going to talk about from this decade, which came out in 1935, which is The Bride of Frankenstein, which is an incredibly interesting film because The Bride of Frankenstein doesn't even show up, even though she's probably one of the most iconic horror characters ever. She doesn't show up till the very end of the film, in the last couple of minutes. This does play a little bit more on the sort of comedic side. It does lean into the dark comedy, but it's still just as well made. The set design is incredible. Karloff again is amazing as Frankenstein's monster, this misunderstood sort of creature that has been forced into life. And I think this film really helps to make him more sympathetic. I think he already was sympathetic in the first Frankenstein film. A lot of people who have never seen or read Frankenstein just assume that Frankenstein, or Frankenstein's monster, I should say, is a monster, is this evil creature. But when you watch these films, or if you've read the book, you can see that he's really not the villain of these films. And Karloff does a fantastic job of conveying that. The other film that I'm going to talk about then for the 1930s is a film from 1934 by a really interesting filmmaker called Edgar G. Ulmer, who very much is a B-picture filmmaker that didn't get a lot of love when he was around, when he was alive. He just kind of just worked his jobs, but has become really sort of influential, further on after he had passed away and after his films had gotten reevaluated, and he's considered now one of like the top filmmakers that was consistently working in B pictures, away from horror. His most famous film is probably Detour, a film noir, which is so incredibly gritty, very B movie, but it's a great little film. But the film I'm going to talk about, which he made in 1934, is called The Black Cat. It does, again, as I mentioned before, star Boris Karloff. It also stars Bela Lugosi. So we have the two icons of Universal horror facing off, not for the first or the last time, I should say. They featured together in a lot of different movies, both playing their most iconic roles and also playing one-off parts. But this film is a masterpiece of atmosphere. It's two behemoths of horror essentially playing a chess game with two innocent lives at stake. It's very gritty. It is a what they call a pre-code film, so it's before the Hays Code came into effect. So like there's some stuff in this film that you wouldn't normally sort of connect with old horror films in terms of like not straight out gore. There's not buckets of blood or anything like that, but there's a lot of times in this film where you're thinking, geez, how did they get away with that? I don't think that would fly in the 30s and 40s, and it didn't really after the Hays Code came in. This was one of the kind of films that wouldn't have been made or would have been heavily edited in the Hays Code. So I definitely recommend The Black Cat. Fantastic film. It's one of the films that's coming to the Criterion Channel. If you are a subscriber to the Criterion Channel, I know obviously a lot of you would be. That's how our podcast got started, was through Criterion Channel picks. The Black Cat is coming to the Criterion Channel in October, I should say. So I would definitely recommend checking it out if you haven't. If it's something that maybe you thought, it's just a Universal horror schlocky fest film. It's not. It's a fantastic film, and recommend that to close out the 1930s. And with that, we're going to move into the 1940s. So into the 1940s, and this is going to be quite of an interesting one because there's three films I've chosen for the 1940s. All happen to be by the same director, working for the same producer. It's kind of one of the iconic director-producer duos in horror history, and that is the partnership between Jacques Tourneur and Val Lewton. So the first film I'm going to talk about is from 1942, and it is the iconic Cat People. For those who haven't seen Cat People, it's a really interesting film. It's about a woman who comes from Europe. She's living in America, and she has this deep fear that she's been cursed by this sort of curse of her European village, where she's going to turn into, this panther compelled to kill whoever she sort of mates with. So she meets this American, but she's too afraid to sort of move, into like a love affair with him because of this fear that she's going to turn into this killer panther. Sounds absolutely batshit insane, and it kind of is, but it works so well because of how much of a talent Tourneur was and how great Val Lewton was at sort of, setting up, these films. Cat People is probably most well known for having what is perhaps the first jump scare. So we all know now that modern horror films are kind of littered with jump scares to the point where you can kind of tell when one is coming. But back in the 40s, that was a completely different thing. Nobody expected something like this in a film. The jump scare for many decades was known as a bus, and probably still is in Hollywood, in filmmaking terms, it's probably still known as a bus. It's only really the modern audiences call it jump scares. But essentially it's a character walking through Central Park. She kind of hears something might be following her, and suddenly a bus just comes and sort of stops at a bus stop right in front of her. And it's that, what we know now as a modern jump scare, that silent, slow, tension building, and then a loud sound happens, but it's not actually something very scary. It's something quite normal, just a bus pulling onto a bus stop. Fabulous film, incredibly well made. Jacques Tourneur, as we're going to talk about, just had such an amazing eye for atmosphere and for storytelling. I think that's the really key thing that really makes his films stand out, is he was able to tell a good story and usually quite economically. A lot of his films are on the shorter side. This one is 73 minutes. I'll give you the times for the other two I'm going to talk about as well. That's another reason why I do like him quite a lot. As you guys, listeners, might know, it's not that I'm not a big fan of long films. I always just like when a storyteller can tell a story, a cohesive story, in a shorter time, sort of below 90 to 100 minutes. I think that's always really interesting. So Cat People is the first one. From there, he made two films in 1943. So you think Cat People is 1942. The next two films were made in 1943. So again, it's going to tie into the economic factor of this film, of this kind of filmmaking, but also how amazing it is and how great these films are. Really attests to his talent. The first one that I'm going to talk about from 1943 is a film called I Walked with a Zombie. Again, maybe an iconic title, but a film that a lot of people might not have actually seen. Basically, it's about a nurse who goes to the Caribbean to care for this sort of rich older patient, and she becomes kind of surrounded by voodooism. I believe the film takes place in Haiti, if I remember correctly, but it's somewhere in the Caribbean. What was immediately really cool to see is that, and this is something that you kind of get worried about when films start bringing in things like voodoo and stuff from other cultures, is that it's going to be insensitive. This is actually very, very tasteful. It's an incredibly tasteful film. There's no sort of messing around or belittling the voodooism. I wouldn't be surprised if Tournier and the writers went into, when they met these people and, got a proper sort of rundown on what their rituals are about and how they're done. Because again, I can't really say for sure because I haven't been involved in a voodoo ritual, but it feels, as an outsider, it feels very, very tasteful. It's very frank, very dignified. But again, it's caked in atmosphere. It's another fantastic film. And again, like I said with Cat People, it's a very cohesive story. It's very well made. The characters are well fleshed out. It's just a well written, well made film. This one clocks in at 69 minutes, so even shorter than Cat People. The final film then from the 1940s, again, this one was made in 1943, again by Jacques Tournier and Val Lewton. And this is probably one of the more well-known ones because it's considered possibly the first slasher movie, or it's certainly very, very influential in the genre, and that's The Leopard Man, which again is even shorter, it's 66 minutes. So I inadvertently went down in sort of time order for how short and long these films are. So it is The Leopard Man. A leopard escapes this publicity stunt thing, this sort of circusy thing. A leopard escapes and people start getting murdered all around town. Is it the leopard? Is it a serial killer? That's kind of up to the audience to figure out as this film goes on. Again, very well made film. The sets, the characters, the storytelling, it's all very, very high class. It's very classy, very well done. So if you're looking for three maybe shorter films that are still extremely high quality, then the last three I've just talked about there from the 1940s should be very, very high up on your watch list. And now let's take a look at the 1950s. So as we move into the 1950s, this is where I think the list is going to evolve a little bit. It's going to be less centric on Hollywood films. It's going to look perhaps at a wider spectrum of horror. This is the part where I kind of struggled to choose only three. There was a lot of standout films in each of these decades, and I tried to be as wide with my scope as I possibly could to try and encompass a little bit of everything. I didn't just want to go, the same kind of horror film over and over again. So we're going to start off with our friend Edgar G. Ulmer, back again. This time is a film he made, another B picture that he made in 1951 called The Man from Planet X. Like, what a title. That is a pure B movie title. And it is a pure B movie, I'm not going to lie to you. It's only 70 minutes long. It was very cheaply made, but again, because Ulmer, he just has that great vision. He's another sort of auteur before auteurism began. He is able to out of pretty much nothing create something that's quite entertaining and quite fun. Frankly, the film is basically about these group of scientists who are looking out for some planet that might collide with the Earth, and an alien sort of from this planet comes to Earth and tries to communicate with them. But it's perhaps he's trying to also sort of try and minimize the threat the planet's going to have before they come and all take over. I'm not going to lie to you, the alien looks awful. It's really cheesy. The suit that he's wearing and the sort of fake alien head looks like, one of the stone heads from Easter Island. It's really, really cheap. But I don't know, there's something in this film that just really works really well. There's something in the corniness and in the cheapness that just really it just really works. I can't really put exactly my finger on it as to why it works so well, but it just does. I think it's just, one of those films where I'm not going to say it's so bad it's good, because it's not bad in any way, but it just has this freshness and this heart and this sort of good cheesiness, kind of like The House on Haunted Hill or a lot of William Castle movies. It has that sort of maybe cheapness or cheesiness that kind of elevates the film, rather than sort of makes it bad, if that makes sense. No, to be fair, there is a lot of nice visuals. The sets for the Scottish moors, very, very, very nice looking. I'm a big fan, and I know a lot of people aren't, but I'm a big fan of fake outdoor sets. Hitchcock used to use a lot of them in his early films as well, and the kind of outdoor set here is not terribly unlike the one used in the 39 Steps. But yeah, the Man from Planet X, if you're looking for some cheap and easy fun and you're into like your sci-fi stuff, then I would certainly recommend that. Now, the next film, this is where things get a little bit different for the rest of the list. So we're going to move away from Hollywood, away from English, language filmmaking for the next two picks. The first one, or the next one I'm going to talk about, I should say, came out in 1952, and it's from a film sort of country that you don't normally, it's from a country, I should say, that you don't normally see a lot of films or a lot of sort of big, famous, influential films come out of, because it's from Finland, and it's called The White Reindeer. It was made by a guy called Eric Blomberg, and I got a copy of this from Eureka. Again, they have a Blu-ray for this, which is really, really, really beautiful Blu-ray. But the restoration and the film is fantastic. It's set in Lapland, which again is a cinematic landscape that you just don't see very often. I'm sure there's probably plenty of films that are set in Lapland, but they're not obviously really filmed there, which this one is. It's set in this sort of very desolate, snowy landscape, and what takes place is pretty much kind of like a folk horror. It's probably the best way to put it. It's about this woman who she marries this sort of guy in her village, but he's very obsessed with hunting and things like that. So she goes to this shaman, who basically tells her how to perform a ritual to make her kind of irresistible to all men. But obviously, like all these kind of films, there are dark repercussions that don't get mentioned initially, and it basically turns her into this kind of vampire creature. It's such a classy film. Again, there's nothing sort of cheap about it, in terms of how the story is made. It's a very authentic film. You can tell this is probably a folk tale, from this country or this region that they've made. They're not trying to make something that's hokey or fake or anything like that. This one would be very much for fans of like Robert Eggers movies, like The Witch and The Lighthouse. They will like this kind of film. I know Zach, who obviously co-hosts the podcast with us, I recommended this film to him a year or two ago, and he really enjoyed it as well. So you don't just have to take my word for it, you can take Zach's as well. So the White Reindeer, I'm not sure if it's streaming anywhere. If you did want to pick up the Eureka copy, you can normally get it pretty cheap from Eureka themselves. Would really, really recommend the film. If you want to see something that's just completely different to anything you would have seen before, you can't go wrong there. And then the last one from the 1950s, this is where we get into territory where we're talking horror adjacent, because we're going to talk about a film that is probably the most Hitchcockian film that Hitchcock never made. It's from a French filmmaker called Henri Georges Clouzot. From 1955, we have Les Diaboliques. Very iconic film. It's very much known for its twist ending, which I'm not going to spoil here if it hasn't already been spoiled for you. But what the film is basically about, it's one of these sort of tales where a wife who's unhappy with her domineering, abusive husband, kills him off. But then there's hints that he might not actually be dead. People talking about them seeing him, things like that. I don't want to talk too much about it because I don't want to get into spoiler territory. But incredibly well made film. So much atmosphere, so much suspense. Again, like I said, it's like this is the kind of film where Hitchcock probably looked at this and said, "Oh, I wish I could have made this film," because it is very Hitchcockian, but there is a lot of horror elements to it as well, which is why I would call it a horror adjacent film. It has that element of suspense and thrill that you would hope to get from this kind of film. So that's going to wrap up the 1950s. So let's take a dive into the 1960s. So, kicking off the 1960s, it would be remiss for me to talk about what I consider to be a miracle of horror and of filmmaking in general, which is a film from 1962 called Carnival of Souls. It's a soul narrative film, I should say, of a guy called Herk Harvey, who made a lot of industrial educational movies, and he had this idea and he got this funding to make this sort of cheap horror film in Salt Lake City in Utah in the US. And it's a film where it shouldn't work. Nothing about this film should work. It's cheaply, shoddily made. It doesn't have much of a story to it. It has a lot of sort of issues with like sound production, things like that. And the first time you watch this movie, you're probably thinking, this is a bit shoddy. Some of this stuff is a bit odd, how bad some of the sound is or how hammy some of the acting is. But then the film ends and it has a twist ending, which I won't go into. But it lets you completely reevaluate the film, and instead of those what would be normally seen as issues or things to sort of mark down a film on, actually end up making the film better because of the twist. And it's a film where when you watch it more and more, when you watch it the second or third or fourth or whatever time, you're sitting there going, Herk Harvey is probably the luckiest man on earth that what would normally be mistakes or would normally be poor filmmaking has ended up elevating a film. And this, I mentioned earlier the Ulmer film Detour, the film noir, and that very much is the same. There's a lot of bad filmmaking in that film that actually makes it better. And Carnival of Souls is one of those movies. So if you've never seen Carnival of Souls, or you've only seen it once and you thought this movie isn't great, why am I watching this movie? I would implore you to watch it and reevaluate it after finishing it, because I think that everything, like, again, maybe I'm being too harsh on the whole movie. There is actually quite a lot of really cool stuff in this film, apart from the mistakes. But I love this film for its mistakes, because the mistakes actually make it a better film when you take the entire narrative into consideration. Now, sort of like with the 1950s, I'm going to try and make things as wide as possible. So I'm going to talk about now, that was a black and white film, Carnival of Souls. I'm going to talk about a film that very much relies on its color for cinematography. And it's filmed by Roger Corman. I could have talked about a lot of Roger Corman films in the 1960s. This is just one I just decided to choose. It's one of the many films he made with Vincent Price, who I absolutely adore. He's one of my favorite actors of all time. And it's one of the many Edgar Allan Poe adaptations that they did together. I'm going to mention The Mask of the Red Death. I think this was the easiest one to talk about, purely because of just how amazing the cinematography is in this film. Roger Corman is obviously an iconic figure as a director, as a producer, as someone who helped a lot of filmmakers get their start, through him, through his production company. But he gets obviously a lot of praise for that, rightly so. But I don't think he gets a lot of praise for the films he actually directed, which is a bit sad because The Mask of the Red Death is as good a horror film as any horror film ever made. It's as good looking as any film that's ever been made, or shot in color at least. I'm not going to talk too much about the plot. A lot of people know the plot already. Poe's work is iconic in its own right. Just to say that I love Vincent Price. I'll watch anything that Vincent Price happens to show up in. He's just the perfect scenery chewer. He's just a perfect mix of classy and corny, and I wouldn't trade him for anything in the world. But this film also looks amazing. So if you're looking for a horror film that is both horrifying while also really beautifully well made, The Mask of the Red Death is definitely the best way to go. And the last movie I'm going to talk about in the 1960s is another film that's kind of horror adjacent. Again, actually, oddly enough, like what I talked about in the 1950s, probably another one for the fans of David Eggers. And we're going to talk about a filmmaker that is very esteemed, very altruistic, probably one of the most influential filmmakers ever made. He's my favorite filmmaker, Mr. Ingmar Bergman. And it's a film he made in 1968 called Hour of the Wolf, with Max von Sydow and Liv Ullmann. Liv Ullmann's my favorite actress of all time. I think she is the GOAT. But Hour of the Wolf is a very interesting film. It's pretty much Bergman's only kind of attempt at kind of pure horror. There is other films he made that kind of touches on horror elements like Persona and The Virgin Spring, but we can really call this like a pure kind of psychological horror. If you like your horror films to be rooted in psychology, while also having sort of ambiguous elements, kind of like like I mentioned, Robert Eggers films, but a lot of the what they call the elevated horror that's come out in the last kind of 10 years, of kind of introspective horror films, a lot of those would take from Hour of the Wolf. And if you're a fan of that kind of modern trend of horror films, I certainly recommend Hour of the Wolf. It's a quite disturbing film, not from like a gory perspective, or it's just like in terms of the atmosphere, the sort of psychological aspect of it, and some of the things that happen in the film are quite deeply disturbing. But Bergman's a master filmmaker. He's, like I said, he's just objectively speaking, he's one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. In my personal opinion, I think he's the greatest filmmaker of all time. And The Hour of the Wolf is, if you're looking for something a little bit different to his chamber pieces, if you've seen like a lot of his more famous films, like Through a Glass Darkly or Autumn Sonata or Cries and Whispers, those more sort of straight drama films. Hour of the Wolf, if you're looking for something a little bit different, certainly a way to go if you're more of an art film kind of person. Now let's dive into the 1970s. So I'm going to kick off my 1970s with a Giallo film, but not the Giallo film you probably anticipate me talking about. So for those unfamiliar, Giallo film is kind of like a subgenre of kind of horror thriller films that came to prominence in the 1970s primarily through Dario Argento and Mario Bava, who was a little bit before in the 1960s, but 1970s kind of really kicked into gear. There was a lot of these films made. The one I'm going to talk about came out in 1972, and it's by a filmmaker called Emilio Miraglia, and it's called The Red Queen Kills 7 Times. Fantastic Giallo title. All Giallo films usually have these crazy titles. This one stars Barbara Boucher, who's amazing. She's a really great actress. Basically, it's a really good sort of mix of classical and modern. So Barbara Boucher's character, she grows up kind of in this aristocratic family. Her and her sister, as they were kids, kind of heard about this legend of this where basically one sister will kill 7 people, the 7th being the sister. Now, most of it takes place in modern times, but there's a nice mix between when she goes back to the old family castle to kind of investigate this mystery, because suddenly this red cloaked killer starts killing people off, and she starts getting afraid that maybe it's her sister who's gone missing and potentially is now going to be hunting to kill her down as part of this family curse. I won't go too much into it because, again, I don't want to get into spoiler territory if you've never seen it. This one should be available on the Arrow Player. That's certainly where I watched it. So if you are subscribed to the Arrow Player, take a look out for it there. They definitely did a Blu-ray release of it, so if you're more of a physical media person, I would certainly recommend that. The Red Queen Kills Seven Times is probably my favorite giallo. I know a lot of people like, Deep Red, or The Bird of Crystal Plumage, those Argento films, or even the Mario Bava ones like Black Sunday. But yeah, the Red Queen Kills Seven Times is just something I love about this movie. I think it's a really good balance between sort of classic sort of gothic horror and also that sort of modern proto slasher. And kind of staying in Italy then for the next film, it takes place mainly in Venice, but it was made by an Australian with a sort of largely sort of multinational cast. It's called Don't Look Now from 1973, by Nick Roeg, who's obviously a very acclaimed filmmaker, definitely one of these sort of auteur guys. For those who've never seen Don't Look Now, it's a really sort of sad film, really. It's about Donald Sutherland and Judy Christie, who their daughter dies in their family home. So they go on a trip to Venice just to try and, just try and escape the misery, just to try and reclaim their lives a little bit. But at the same time, there's these slew of murders that are happening, and both stories begin to kind of intertwine, especially when Donald Sutherland's character starts seeing visions of what might be the ghost of his daughter, wearing this red coat that she was wearing when she died. It's one of those films where it has the most batshit insane ending. Just one of the most craziest endings in a film I've ever seen. For those who've seen it and are listening to this are probably nodding in agreement right now. It's just absolutely crazy. If you've never seen it, don't read into it too much. You're definitely better off going into this film blind. I unfortunately was not going into this film blind because I had this film spoiled for me many years ago. When Channel 4 did a series of like 100 scariest movie moments, something like that, I think it was called. For those who sort of grew up in Ireland and the UK, you might be familiar with the special. They usually put it on around Halloween time. And unfortunately, the ending was spoiled on me as a young kid. And when I went to visit this film, I knew exactly what was going to happen. But even then, knowing exactly what's going to happen, it's still just crazy how mind-boggling it is. So Don't Look Now, certainly recommended. I know the Criterion copy is out of print. If you are multi-regional, or if you're like me in Region B, Studio Canal did a very nice 4K release of this with Blu-ray as well, of course. So certainly recommend picking it up because it's a fantastically well-made, very artful film, apart from being a straight horror. And finally, if we were going to talk about 1970s horror films, I think Zach would kill me if I didn't mention the classic John Carpenter 1978 slasher film Halloween. It's one of my favorite films of all time. It's like a top 5 all-time film for me. I've seen it, I don't even know, well over 20 times maybe. I watch it every year on Halloween, much to my partner's chagrin of her having to watch it every Halloween with me. But there's probably not a soul, or very few souls, who've never seen the original Halloween. It's the perfect horror film. Everything about it is just perfection. The atmosphere, that sort of ambiguity that Carpenter creates surrounding, the shape Michael Myers. The sequels are very, very hit and miss. Like most slasher franchises, the sequels are very, very hit and miss because they often try and demystify. Well, in Halloween's case anyway, it tries to demystify and give Michael Myers a motive when I think he is so much scarier when he has no motive. And that's what's so perfect about Halloween, because this could be anyone. This could be happening to anyone. And the sequels demystified that a little bit. But the first film, the original Halloween, is the best horror film ever made, and in my opinion is one of the best films ever made. It's obviously incredibly influential. It basically, even though it wasn't the first slasher film, it really kicked off, what would be the slasher film sort of craze in the 80s, with, a lot of copycat films like, Friday the 13th and The Burning, and, films like that. But if you've somehow never seen the OG, if you've never seen Halloween, make that your must-watch viewing on Halloween, because it's just head and shoulders above any other kind of film in that subgenre, and in my opinion, it's the best horror film ever made. And now let's move into the 1980s. So, speaking of iconic pinnacles of horror filmmaking, let's just get this one out of the way. 1980, the legendary Stanley Kubrick released The Shining, an adaptation of a book by Stephen King, which Stephen King didn't like very much because it doesn't really stick to his book a whole ton. But yeah, The Shining, it's again, like Halloween, it's one of those films where if you've somehow never seen it, make sure you change that. It's a film, again, I've seen a lot of times. I think I might have. I think I love it a little bit less now than I did when maybe I first watched it. But one thing that we can say for sure is when it comes to a film portraying cold dread, The Shining does it better than pretty much any other film. There's not a lot of jump scares. There's not a lot of scares in general, but there is just this creeping dread and fear that just permeates through every single scene. It's like it's so thick, this sort of atmosphere. I don't know why I'm going to be questioning how Kubrick did it, because obviously he did it because he was a genius. But everything, how this film makes you feel, it makes you sit there and squirm for 2 hours or so without actually really doing a whole lot until the last 20 minutes. And that I can really attest to Kubrick's, ability as a filmmaker. It might not be for everybody. Some people might think it's a bit too slow. But for someone who likes atmospheric horror, for someone who is not, I don't really care about jump scares. I actually prefer my horror without jump scares. I think they're very cheap a lot of the time. Then The Shining is a fantastic horror film. There's a reason why it's so iconic. If you've somehow never seen it, again, see it. One thing I recommend you do not do is go down the rabbit hole of all the crazy fan theories. There's a documentary called Room 237, where a bunch of crackpots give all their theories about what The Shining is really about. I'm sorry if you are a listener and you are one of those crackpots, but you need to go outside and breathe some air. Some crazy stuff happens in that documentary. If you wanted to watch it, I would recommend doing it for comedic value, as opposed to actually taking a grain of anything that those people say. Moving into more horror adjacent ground, we're going to be talking, this is a bit more sort of sci-fi horror, and that is the 1983 film from David Cronenberg called Videodrome. It stars James Woods and Debbie Harry from Blondie. Basically about this sort of really trashy TV channel station that James Woods' character happens upon and becomes obsessed with, because it's all just about torture and death and punishment and all these sort of crazy sadistic things. And he becomes very obsessed with, what the source is and, where is this station coming from, all this kind of stuff. It's a violent film. It's a sexually aggressive film. It's very much sums up Cronenberg's, overall of his work. It really has a lot of his sort of themes that follow him throughout his whole career are shown here in Videodrome. Very interesting film. Even, for something that might sound very sort of dark, it's very entertaining. That's one thing I have to say about this film. I thought it was awesome. I didn't expect to like it at all. From reading about it, I thought this is just not going to be my cup of tea, and I came out of it loving it. I thought it was such a really entertaining film. It's very 1980s. So if you've never seen Videodrome, definitely put that on your list for something to watch this Halloween as well. And the last film I'm going to talk about in the 1980s is yet another sort of franchise starter. along with Halloween and another one I'm going to talk about a little bit later. This would be sort of one of my favorite sort of franchises, and it's the 1984 film from Wes Craven, Nightmare on Elm Street. I don't actually, funnily, I'm recommending Nightmare on Elm Street here, but it's not actually my favorite one of the series. I'll be talking about my favorite one shortly. But I kind of have to recommend this one because if you've never seen the series in general, you kind of have to start, with the first one. It is a very, very solid film. It's a good sort of entry point into the franchise, and it is a franchise that actually has quite a lot of good films, which is strange for slasher sort of horror franchises. A lot of the time, there's like one or two good ones, and then they kind of dip pretty dramatically from there. I think Nightmare on Elm Street is pretty consistent across the board. The first one, as I mentioned, is good. The second one wasn't very liked when it came out, but it's actually a really interesting film to watch now because it has a lot of gay subtext. So if you're interested in that kind of aspect, the second Nightmare on Elm Street film has that. The third one is often called by fans anyway the kind of best one. From there, it does dip a little bit until another film, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But if you're interested in the franchise, Nightmare on Elm Street by Wes Craven, obviously Freddy Krueger is one of the most iconic sort of characters in film, not just horror. Every little kid knows and is terrified of Freddy Krueger. So if you're one of those people who, like me, was terrified of Freddy Krueger as a child but hadn't actually seen a Nightmare on Elm Street film, and up until like your sort of late teens, like me, definitely recommend making that one of your films to watch. So that's closing out the 1980s. We're going to start now with the 1990s, and it's going to be Familiar. So speaking of Wes Craven, speaking of Freddy Krueger, the first one I'm going to talk about in the 1990s came out in 1994, and it was one of the many sort of sequels for the Nightmare on Elm Street series. This is Wes Craven's New Nightmare. I love this film so much. It's so creative. It's one of the many evolutions of the meta horror filmmaking. I can't sit here and say it's the first meta horror film. Jason Lives probably beats it. But Wes Craven's New Nightmare, there's just something amazing about this film. It's kind of a prototype for another film, which I will talk about in a couple of moments, for this kind of meta horror. It's definitely it's my favorite of the sort of Nightmare on Elm Street series. It's my personal favorite. I think it's an incredibly well made film. It's so well written. I love the meta aspect. For those who might not be familiar about it, maybe just kind of heard about it in passing but don't actually know what it's about. This film takes place during the making of a Nightmare on Elm Street film. Heather Langenkamp, who was in the original, is playing herself, who's coming back to play in a new Nightmare on Elm Street film. Robert Englund again is playing himself. Wes Craven is in the film playing himself. Very meta. If you're into that kind of thing, then New Nightmare is really, really going to be up your alley. It's very much ahead of its time in terms of how sort of meta filmmaking would become a lot more popular a little bit down the line. Speaking of meta horror and speaking of Wes Craven, we're going to talk about what is probably my second favorite horror film ever, and that came out in 1996, and it's Scream. Scream, out of all the horror franchises, in my opinion, Scream is the most consistent. There's 5 Scream films out. 4 of them are great. The third one gets dumped on a lot. I don't think it's terrible. It's certainly, it's certainly a lot worse than all the others. But it's not often you have 5 horror films in a series, and 4 out of 5 are what I would consider at least 8 out of 10 films. But Scream for me is one of the most perfect films ever made. It's everything tonally about it is what's perfect. It really balances the horror with the meta sort of commentary, with the little bit of humor as well. Sidney Prescott is awesome. Is just a fantastic character in general. Played by Neve Campbell. You have Courtney Cox, who's fantastic in it as well as Gail Weathers. Just the characters, all of them really are all fantastic. The villains are great. Ghostface is obviously iconic as well. Yeah, I don't have a single bad thing to say about Scream. Everything it says about the horror genre and everything it tries to replicate about the horror genre is done so perfectly. It's done so in a way that's very tasteful. It's not, taking the mick or taking the piss out of horror movies in any way, shape, or form. It is a film that it takes little bits and pieces from iconic horror movies, but doesn't rely on them. It still tells its own cohesive story, and it's a really well made story. It's a really well put together story. So yeah, if you've somehow never seen Scream, again, it's another one for your books. To close out the 90s, then, I'm going to talk about one that's a little bit maybe underrated. It's a film in 1997 by the irreplaceable David Lynch. Obviously, everybody knows David Lynch. He's one of the most dynamic filmmakers ever to work, in Hollywood or in the world, really. But he had a film that came out in 1997 that starred Bill Pullman and Patricia Arquette called Lost Highway. And for the longest time, I thought I must have been the only person that really loved Lost Highway. And I think maybe it's because just it was largely unavailable up until very recently. Criterion are putting out, or have put out, a Blu-ray for it with a new restoration that was looked after by Lynch himself, which is amazing, because I've only ever seen this film on like an old DVD that wasn't even from sort of the UK, where I buy most of my sort of stuff from. I think it was like from Denmark or Sweden or something. I remember having to change the language in the menu, but it was a film that I just became enamored with. And again, it's maybe more horror adjacent, but there are some horrible, scary things that happen in this movie. The villain of this film, this sort of unknown kind of stranger who may or may not be the devil himself, is so quietly terrifying. And it's a film that's really built on dread. Some people maybe kind of chalk it off as kind of like a prototype for the kind of atmosphere that Lynch would do for Mulholland Drive, but I think that's kind of a cop-out to say that. I think Lost Highway is its own film. It has its own story, its own themes. I think it relies or leans into horror a lot more than Mulholland Drive does, which I should maybe cut in and say Mulholland Drive is one of my favourite films of all time. I'm not shitting on Mulholland Drive in any way, shape, or form. But Lost Highway, I think, is underrated, both by Lynch fans and just by wider fans in general. And I hope this new Criterion release will perhaps sway people in the other direction, or maybe sort of let them see what I've been seeing for the best part of 10 years. Hopefully it'll come onto the channel sometime soon as well, because I don't think it's actually streaming anywhere either. So for those listeners who are Criterion channel subscribers, maybe keep an eye out. Maybe sometime in November we might get Lost Highway, the Criterion edition, on the channel as well. So out of the 90s into the millennium, into the 2000s. Now, dear listeners, I'm going to need you to stick with me for this first film of the 2000s. It is the most fun film out of all the films I've talked about so far, and out of all the ones I'm going to talk about. This film is absolutely the most fun. Some people hate this film for some reason that I just do not understand. It came out in 2003 by a guy called Ronnie Yu, and it is Freddy versus Jason. I have loved Freddy vs. Jason since it came out, since I was old enough to watch it. I saw Freddy vs. Jason before I ever saw a Nightmare on Elm Street film, or before I ever saw Friday the 13th film. I love it. I think it's so fun. It's so cheesy, I should say. It's just pure 2000s horror filmmaking. It's not very pretty. It's all digital. But it just has its own just unique, weird charm. Has bad CGI, has crazy kills, it has little quips, it has, crap rock soundtrack. It's everything that sums up 2000s, early 2000s sort of horror filmmaking. But because we just have these two icons of horror going up against one another, it has a unique charm. And weirdly enough, it actually has a really compelling plot. The main character's arc is actually really good. it's not too dissimilar maybe from Scream's kind of main storyline, but um, yeah, Freddy versus Jason. If you've ever dismissed this film or refused to watch it because you think it's trash, it is trash, but it's so fun. It's just pure cheese, slimy, early 2000s trashy film making, and it's so fun. If you're looking just for something easy to watch with gory kills, you really just cannot go wrong. Now, in the next one we're going to talk about, again, it's kind of a film that weirdly its reputation has diminished over time, and it could be because of a slew of sequels that were not as good. But like, this film was a phenomenon when it first came out. It's Paranormal Activity from Oren Peli. It's it's weird how much people hate this movie or hate this series now. I suppose I can understand hating the series a little bit, and maybe I can understand hating the movie a little bit because, despite the Blair Witch Project coming out like 10 years prior to this, roughly, this film was responsible for the craze of, the handheld kind of camera craze, found footage, and there's a lot of terrible films in that subgenre. So maybe that's the reason why people hate on Paranormal Activity. But I rewatched this earlier this year. I was kind of making my way back through the series, and like, this is a damn good film. I remember watching this film in the theaters as a teenager, and people were like, I've never seen people more scared in my life watching this movie. For a film where like not a whole lot happens for like 70-80% of the film, I've never seen people more scared in their whole life. Especially during the kind of last 15-20 minutes of this film, people were jumping out of their seats. And when I think back to those times, it does kind of remind me, of what horror films can and should do, and that's really entertain us and scare us at the same time. A lot of horror films in the 2000s, which you're not going to see any of them here, that just became kind of gore fests. And I'm talking about like the Hostel movies, Saw movies, that kind of torture porn subgenre. It doesn't really scare you, it more kind of horrifies you. And then you have, in like the 2010s, you have all the films that kind of relied on jump scares. And I don't really even call those horror films. I call them startling films, because it's all they do. They just kind of make you jump and go, ooh, and then you're fine again 2 seconds later. But I think Paranormal Activity, it creates dread, it creates horror, and it's also very highly entertaining as well. It's a really well balanced film, and I hope that people maybe revisit it and give it a fair shot, because we'll never see it'd be very unlikely to see a phenomenon like Paranormal Activity again for a long time. Just in terms of like the viral marketing, the fact that it was so cheaply made and made so much money, it was such a huge success. Yeah, I really just have to give props to the filmmaker here. Paranormal Activity, it's a good film, and I urge you to maybe revisit it if you haven't watched it since it came out and you've been sort of having to watch all the sequels and stuff. I would give the first one a revisit, and you might see what I've been seeing. We're going to close out the 2000s then with maybe a lesser known film. It's a well known film in horror circles, but for general sort of film goers, it might not be as known. The filmmaker is getting a lot of plaudits at the moment, Mr. Ty West. There's a film he made in 2009 called The House of the Devil. Very much a slow burn horror film. It's probably as slow burn horror as you can get, really. It's one of those films that just creates atmosphere over the course of the film and then lets it all blow out in the last 20 minutes. Kind of like a kettle, just lets it all build and build and build, and then just releases all that tension in the last 20 minutes for a really, really great ending. It's very much indebted to 80s in terms of the aesthetic, and not very much in the way the plot is set out. But in terms of the aesthetic, it's set in the 80s, and it really pays homage to that quite a lot. It does feature a small role from Greta Gerwig, obviously quite famous in her own right now as a filmmaker, a very talented filmmaker as well, I should say. But if you're looking for maybe something a bit more slow burn, So kind of the antithesis perhaps of a Paranormal Activity or a Freddy versus Jason. Very much recommend The House of the Devil. Definitely for fans of maybe like something like Rosemary's Baby, something maybe that's a bit more sort of darkly twisted but very much slow burn as opposed to sort of making you jump out of your seat every few minutes. Now let's look at the 2010s. So the first film I'm going to talk about in the 2010s is it's another one of those films that not a lot of people are maybe have seen it, actually sat down and watched it. They may be aware of it because this film got its funding because of a speculative trailer that they made. A bunch of filmmakers, a bunch of indie filmmakers made a trailer for a film hoping to sell, hoping to sort of get financing to make a feature length based on the trailer. And the trailer went viral on YouTube, back in maybe like 2008, 2009, 2010, that kind of time. But the full film itself didn't get made and released until 2011, so it just sneaks into the 2010s. And I remember watching the trailer, the sort of speculative trailer, with my friends, and we all thought it was just kind of funny. We thought, this film looks so corny, it looks so goofy, why are they even making this? And it just became kind of a bit of a joke, even though none of us had actually seen the film. It became kind of a bit of a joke amongst us. And then I actually sat down and watched it a few years later. I was like, I'm looking for something to watch. I can't believe they actually made this movie. Let me watch it. It's called Grave Encounters. And this film has no right to be good. But it really is. It's like props to the filmmakers. They actually managed to make a film that is scary, relevant to sort of what horror from a TV perspective is, because it's essentially a play on ghost hunting TV shows, probably specifically Ghost Adventures. The opening credits, or fake opening credits for this film's TV show, is pretty much a riff on the opening credits to Ghost Adventures. But yeah, Grave Encounters, it's a really well made film. It did have a sequel as well, which is also quite good. Definitely better than what me and my friends gave it credit for when we initially saw the trailer. And if you're like me, and if you remember kind of when the trailer went viral and you dismissed it and you never actually watched it, I certainly recommend giving it a try. And you might find yourself very surprised. I know I just said a few moments ago at Paranormal Activity that it created a slew of found footage type films, most of which were quite bad. But I think this one's very good because it's a little bit different. It's not just a straight found footage film where basically it's basically a splicing together of what was going to be a TV show, a ghost hunting TV show. But obviously the crew got a lot more than they bargained for. So if you manage to find it, it's probably one of those films that you just find it on YouTube, or it might be streaming somewhere. But if you can get your hands on it, I certainly recommend it. It goes under the radar, and it's really, really great film. So from there, I'm going to talk about a film again that's kind of a bit more under the radar, perhaps. It's by a guy called Ben Wheatley, who's pretty well known over in the UK where he's from. Might not be as well known over in America, but he made a film called Kill List. Again, it's 2011, so just sneaks into the 2010s. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about Kill List because it is a film that you will get so much more out of if you go in completely blind, like not knowing much of what the film is about. I'll give you a very, very, very basic rundown, which basically it's about these two soldiers who kind of become hitmen on the side, and they're given this assignment that becomes very weird, and that's all I'm going to say really. But it's such a, again, deeply atmospheric, folk horror-y. It's very different. It even has a bit of some maybe action or thriller elements, but I would definitely put this down as a horror film. I call it a horror film for sure. It's on the shorter side. I think it's around just about an hour and a half. So if you're looking for something that is very different, has twists and turns, it's going to bring you places you didn't expect the film to bring you, Highly recommend looking at Kill List. I know it was previously on the Criterion channel, so hopefully it is streaming somewhere else this October, and you manage to get your hands on it, because I think it's a film that not enough people have seen or even heard of. So I definitely want to give it a shout out if you're one of those people who maybe hasn't heard of it before, or has heard of it but maybe hasn't gotten around to seeing it. Make sure you see it, because it's just one of those films where you have to see it all play out to believe it. Lastly, in the 2010s, that I'm going to talk about is definitely the most well known from these three. That's the Ari Aster film Hereditary. I think most horror fans will have seen this by now. A lot of general audiences would have seen it by now. Hereditary for me is like the perfect supernatural horror film, because it plays a lot on ambiguity. It plays a lot on is any of this actually happening? It does that very, very well. It's well written. The script is really, really good. It's obviously well made. Ari Aster is a very capable filmmaker. But what really, really, really makes this film a top tier is, and it's something that I unfortunately don't get to say about a lot of horror films, but the lead performance from Toni Collette is just phenomenal. How she wasn't even nominated for an Oscar, when this film came out, is just utterly shambolic. As a grieving mother, she is just so intense in her grief. She makes this film. If this performance wasn't as good as it is, I don't think the film as a whole would be as good as it is. She holds this film to a higher standard. Toni Collette, I feel, is maybe an underrated actress just in general. She's amazing in pretty much everything she's been in. She's fantastic. Just a funny kind of side note for Hereditary. I'd first seen it myself in the theaters, and I thought it was fantastic. I sat at the edge of my seat the entire film, slack-jawed at what I was watching, and I watched it with my fiance a couple of years ago. She had never seen it and she wanted to watch it, and it utterly terrified her. She couldn't go to sleep. It was late and she was terrified of what she had just seen, and with everything with Toni Collette especially. So in order to make her be able to sleep, she really wanted to watch another Toni Collette movie called Muriel's Wedding, which was filmed in Toni Collette's native Australia. So if you are like my fiance and you are looking for some tonic after watching Hereditary, that might help you sleep afterwards. As a non-horror recommendation, I do recommend Muriel's Wedding. It's actually quite a fun, funny comedy film from Australia, which, again, a lot of maybe Western, sort of UK, America, Ireland, we wouldn't see a lot of films from Australia outside of the super famous ones, like Picnic at Hanging Rock. So Muriel's Wedding is a non-horror recommendation, but Hereditary is the true recommendation for the 2010s. So let's move now into the 2020s. So I'm going to preface the 2020s just by mentioning the fact that I am not well known for keeping up with the newest films. So don't be annoyed that if I haven't picked your favorite film from the last 2 years, because I just don't keep up with a lot of the newer releases. I often see them after they've come out for a little while. So the films I'm going to talk about for the 2020s, for the last 2 years up until now, are probably a bit more on the more well-known side. The first one you might be surprised me mention. It's technically 3 films that I'm going to be recommending as one film. It was part of this thing that Netflix did last year. They released 3 horror films once a week. It was a trilogy of films, and they released one every week leading up to Halloween. It was a series called Fear Street, and they did 3 of them. The first one based in 1994, the next one based in 1978, and the last one based in 1666. And each of them kind of embraces the era that they take place in. They're not like amazing, but they're super fun, and they're way more gory and horror-y than I actually expected going in. When I saw that they were based on a series by R.L. Stine, who you might know or should know did the Goosebumps series of books, I was expecting Goosebumpsy kind of film, just kind of easygoing, maybe sort of something that's geared more towards kind of early teenagers. But the film, the kills in this film are really, really, really gory, really out there. It definitely wasn't what I expected going in, but I think it balances that kind of fun sort of element with the sort of really, really nasty kills really well. So if you're looking for like maybe like a trilogy that is interconnected, don't think these are three completely separate films. They all play into one another into the sort of larger timeline. If you're looking for something like that, where kind of like Freddy versus Jason, where the kills are gory, but you're also going to have fun. The Fear Street series, I would recommend those. They're very different. For the next one, then for the 2020s, again, this is actually something that came out earlier this year. In fact, the next two films I'm going to talk about came out this year in 2022, earlier in the year. And I'm going to talk about Scream 5. Obviously, I already talked about Scream, so I'm not going to rehash about how much I love the Scream series. But Scream 5, I find it really weird that people didn't really like this one as much, or maybe didn't get as good reviews as Scream 4. I thought it was fantastic. I thought the filmmakers really knew exactly what kind of film they were making, in terms of the era of horror that we are now in, with this era of legacy sequels. And this is something that, because it's a Scream film, they of course talk about legacy sequels in the film, as they're trying to figure out who the Ghostface killer is this time around. But I loved it. I saw it in the theaters. I've seen it again since it came out on digital. I really loved it. It's probably like my third favorite Scream film after the first two. Again, kills are good. It's a good story. Like all the Scream films, the mystery behind who Ghostface is really propels it. I think the wider cast is quite good. Probably better than the one in the 2014 Scream 4 came out. I can't remember. But I think it was better than the one in Scream 4. The wider cast, I should say, was maybe a bit more likable in this film. But yeah, Scream 5, if you didn't get around to see it, or maybe the reviews put you off, listen to my review instead. I'm recommending Scream 5, or just Scream, as it's known as, because obviously that's the way they do legacy sequels. So it's just called Scream, but it is Scream 5 in reality, and I do recommend it. The last film that I'm going to talk about then, again, as I said, from earlier in 2022, if you somehow missed this film, or it's been off your radar for whatever reason, you must be living under a rock, as we once again talk about our friend Ty West, and it's his film X. X is it's a really interesting film. You watch the first hour and you think this is kind of like a sleazy porno, but then it becomes a slasher film, and it's the second half of the film which really, really makes it. The cast is all really fun. We have Maya Goth, we have Jenna Ortega, who was also in Scream 5, interestingly enough, Brittany Snow, Kit Kudai. It has a good cast. Ty West, and this is something that Zach talked about recently on our podcast. Ty West was kind of away from horror for a long time, and he came back with X, and it's like he never went away. I know that the prequel to X, Pearl, is out in the theaters at the moment, and there's already another film of this trilogy that's already been announced called Maxine. So if you're looking to get in on the ground floor with these films while you still can, check out X. It should be available on digital now at the moment. Pearl is in theaters right now from May 24, and Maxine should be out sometime next year, I believe, as well. But yeah, X is it's entirely different to anything you would have seen before from a horror film. It is super sleazy, but also really well made, and really pays homage to a lot of horror, especially in the 70s. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is probably the biggest influence on this film, just from a stylistic point of view. So there we have it, guys. If you're still around listening to me, I appreciate you listening to me. Hopefully you enjoyed the recommendations. Hopefully there's stuff that you can take away that you might not have heard of or might not have seen before. If you don't follow me on Letterboxd, my Letterboxd is in the description of the episode. It's also the Owls23. If you want to give me a follow on Letterboxd, I will be making a list of all the films I talked about, so you don't have to keep pausing and put stuff on your watch list. Feel free to go to Letterboxd, and you'll be able to see the list there as well if you want to copy things across. Next episode, we will be talking about more horror films. It is that time of year, so strap in. If you like horror, strap in. Next episode, we're also going to be talking about a couple of horror films that Zach has put on the table for us, as you might have heard at the end of the last episode. So once again, thanks, and we'll see you again soon.